Hey everybody, this is Scott Arnell, and welcome to this episode of the SRI 360 podcast, where in every episode I interview world-class, sustainable, and responsible investors, executives, or entrepreneurs who are driving positive change in the world while achieving market returns. And I do this in order to bring you the lessons that they've learned along the way from their investment activities and their experiences, and to find out what they are actually doing and how they are doing it so that you can have better insights into the different SRI investing strategies that are actually being done today and what they're actually doing right now, and doing it across many different asset classes. And hopefully this will help you invest in a more purposeful way and to invest for positive impact for a better world through your investment activities. Now today, I'm speaking with Marisa Drew, and that's spelled D-R-E-W. And Marisa is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Standard Chartered Bank in London. But this discussion will not be about Standard Chartered Bank, because my interview with Marisa took place some months back when I was finishing my book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 Degrees, when she was then the Chief Sustainability Officer for Credit Suisse, where she had worked for nearly 19 years. So our discussion today will be exclusively about Marisa's experience at Credit Suisse's sustainability program. Now, I think you'll find today's discussion quite unique, because Marisa comes to sustainable and responsible investing from a long career in investment banking, which is not at all the norm in the SRI space. And furthermore, Marisa describes herself as someone who was formerly an SRI cynic, and she became what she calls an SRI convert. Marisa spent many years in the leveraged finance business in Europe, first at Merrill Lynch. We spoke about how she started a women's network at Merrill in London and the challenges associated with that, and how she ended up leaving Merrill after many years to start the leveraged finance business for Credit Suisse. And then Marisa describes her road to Damascus conversion to SRI when her group CEO called her out of the blue and asked her to start the bank's Impact Advisory Finance Group, and how she feels that her iBanking background prepared her well for that. We spent a lot of time, actually most of the rest of our time together, speaking about the market forces and the political reality that is forcing a sea change in the bank's business to transition to sustainability, and the role that the bank has to play to transition their clients. We got into some specific types of products that they've developed for their clients. We spent a good deal of time on the whole subject of the great intergenerational wealth transfer from the baby boomers to the millennial generation, and how the millennials are transforming the dynamics of the asset management business. And she provides a lot of rare firsthand insights into the millennial investor perspective and the points of view as they see it from inside the bank at Credit Suisse. And we touch on several other subjects, like getting the bank to net zero by 2050, Credit Suisse's focus on biodiversity, and their belief in the power of creating products through partnerships, and we touch on a whole lot more. My conversation with Marisa was hugely insightful for me, and I think you will find it eye-opening for you. And now, please enjoy meeting Marisa Drew. You mentioned you have a family home in Connecticut. Are you from Connecticut? Or?
My husband is. Where he grew up, and his entire life was in this very small town in Connecticut on the shoreline. I can't claim, I always say I'm from everywhere and nowhere, because my father was an Air Force pilot, so he moved every couple of years. So I was about half outside the U.S. and half inside the U.S. from my early years.
So you moved around a lot, but then you ended up going to the University of Virginia.
My father then was in the Pentagon, and so we were in the bedroom community outside of Washington, and ended up going to UVA as my undergrad. And where it all started.
And then you started out at Kidder Peabody as an analyst. So what were you doing there?
Yeah, I can sort of give you my history. I mean, I often characterize myself as somebody with a lot of energy and no direction. So I had followed a number of things, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I originally thought I wanted to serve my country in politics. So I was very much oriented that way. And then when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to intern with a first-time congressman. And after doing that for a period of time, I realized I didn't want to be in politics. A very idealistic guy, have to balance all of his constituencies. And I looked at the slow pace of how things actually got done, and somehow that didn't sit well with me. So then I thought I wanted to serve my country in the diplomatic corps, and ended up with an internship in the State Department, working for the wonderful Secretary of State, George Shultz, at the time. Again, fascinating, learned a lot. But I also realized as a as a career diplomat. And again, your pace of change is reasonably slow. It's a long burn type of thing if you're going to try to get something done. So all of these things were informative for me as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I was recruited out of undergraduate to come into investment banking. And I didn't really know anything about investment banking, but those were the early formation days of the analyst program, where they would bring in a class of people. And it was a very structured program, 2 years. And you got the deep immersion in banking. And then after the 2 years, if you wanted to stay in banking, they essentially kicked you out and said you have to go get an MBA because that was the track back then. But I was an analyst at Kidder for the 2 years, enjoyed it. And what I liked about it was the fast pace and the fact that you were sort of working on multiple deals at the time at different stages. And that very much speaks to my, I guess, short attention span. I think the love for the capital markets bit as well. And I sort of like the amount of responsibility that you get at a young age and all those things. So anyhow, at the end of the 2 years, it was expected to go back and get your MBA. But at that point, I didn't feel like I had enough life experience to go back to school yet. So I had the opportunity to then go to work in private equity. And the Trump Group is not affiliated at all with the Donald. Name. There were two South African brothers they were one of the early recipients of Mike Milken's funding. So they were leveraged buyout guys that were focused on real estate and retail acquisitions. And so I worked for them in that capacity and did that for a couple of years and then had the opportunity to become an entrepreneur with some former banking colleagues who were prepared to fund an idea that we had kicked around when we were in the analyst program. And I always thought that I would be an entrepreneur later in life, perhaps, but I didn't want to pass the opportunity. So they provided the funding and I ran a business that was associated with computer education. So this is obviously a very long time ago, when you had PCs in the homes and the schools. And the ticket that everybody thought to a great successful career in life was being computer facile. So we ran learning centers and taught everybody from 2-year-olds to 50-year-olds, just the computer literacy, really. And it was a very successful business. We were bursting at the seams. But once I got it up and running, I was sort of intellectually had bored and plateaued and couldn't really see myself doing that for the long term, just opening more and more centers. So I had the opportunity to sell that business and then it was time to go back to business school. So I decided that I wanted to go back to school and really figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And as I reflected on all the experience that I had, banking was really it for me. I wanted to, the second time around, though, be very deliberate in what I wanted to do in banking. And it all coalesced in my mind that what I enjoyed, and part of the reason I think there was a luster of being an entrepreneur, was I'm fascinated with those who build businesses, how they think about risk, how they take risk. And while I didn't want to be an entrepreneur myself, having done it, what I thought that if you could be the banker to the entrepreneur, that could be the holy grail for me. And so that launched me into the leveraged finance space, where I basically spent a very large portion of my career banking early stage high growth companies. I've loved every minute of it. At heart, I consider myself a financier to the early stage or growth stage companies.
I read somewhere that you were also quite active in not just in the leveraged finance, but active in cultural things. And you established like the first women's network while you were there.
Yeah, I was recruited out of business school by Merrill into the Leveraged Finance Group. And I started there in New York. And then I was increasingly doing deals internationally. And I very much felt that there should be a standalone asset class for leveraged finance in Europe. At the time, what was happening is if you were doing deals for a European company, you were distributing them to US investors. But I could see the need for this asset class very serious in Europe. The notion of appropriate leverage to generate shareholder returns was taking hold at the time I was there. And so I followed that philosophy to move to Europe to help start up the LevFin practice for Merrill there. And when I arrived there, one of the things that was very natural as an American was to look around and say, who's going to be the support network? Where are some of the folks that I can form some relationships with? And I looked around and I had asked, and by then I was an MD, and I said to the HR folks, I said, give me the list of all the women who are here in the London office. I'd love to host a little lunch or something to get together and get to know you. And they didn't even have a list. I realized as I went around and spoke systematically to the women, was there any type of a network or a support group of any sort? And it was partly cultural at the time. I think the women were very shy to be part of a group like that. They felt that somehow it might be remedial in nature. And so it was one of those things where we really had to explain to them. And luckily, I was in a senior enough position to do that I said, forming a network is a tool. You need to think about it as a tool to help your career, not something that you should feel less than enthusiastic about. But it was very interesting because when I polled them, I said, let's hold our first women's network meeting. And everyone said, yes, 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 I want it, I want it, I want it. And I held the first meeting and virtually no one showed up. And it was a real wake-up call again. And so I went around and spoke to them and I said, why is this? And they said, well, I feel really awkward and that my boss might think it was a term in the UK called knitting circle. My boss might think that I'm part of a knitting circle. So I basically said to them, listen, you really genuinely have to view this as a tool to help your career. You should not make excuses for this. These informal networks happen all the time in a male-dominated environment. And if any of your bosses give you a hard time, have them talk to me. And that's how it all started. And then it became very, very big event for the bank. And then beyond that, I felt the need to look across the industry. So started something called the Competitors Diversity Forum, which essentially I went and tried to find the most senior woman at every investment bank that was in London. So we had a group of 7 and formed a sort of a coalition in a non-branded, non-competitive way to share experiences, best practices, and what have you. And that's how it got started in the UK. Finally passed the baton, and there are many, many now, and it's all a well-trodden path. But at the time, it was pretty early days.
So then you spent, I don't know, around 10 years or so at Merrill, and you transitioned to Credit Suisse, where you've been a good long time. But I think your departure out of Merrill was kind of a defining moment maybe for you, or an insightful moment for you.
Yep, and it's been public. I was asked by Sheryl Sandberg when she was having her Lean In initiative if a handful of women who were fairly senior in their roles would be very real with their experiences, good and bad, and they really wanted people to quite make themselves quite open and vulnerable so those who were coming up the ranks could really learn. And in my case, it was unfortunate. I was a high producer and thought that I was the shoe-in for the next role, which would have been a group head role. And at the time, for a variety of reasons, that didn't happen for me. And so it was a wake-up moment for me to assess whether there was a perception gap, whether it was just, life, and life isn't always fair or isn't always good go in your direction. But it was a moment for me because I had been so deep into that organization in every way, shape, and form to ask myself, maybe there's something else out there. An opportunity presented itself to join Credit Suisse and help start up a business effort for them in the leveraged finance space. And it was attractive to me to effectively own and build a serious business. And it was the right thing at the right time. And then the rest was sort of history because it was very successful in a very short period of time. And then lots of other opportunities came along the way. And I do look back and say, if I had probably stayed at my existing firm, I'm not sure I would have ever been in a position to run banking. So sometimes, risk to make a change is the right thing for someone's career.
And then it seems like you made a transition, which is the reason why we're speaking this morning. And you set up the IAF, Impact Advisory Finance Department. So maybe you can talk a little bit what that was and what was the impetus behind that.
Up to that point, my career had been pretty linear in the sense that the next step was to assume bigger and bigger businesses, but essentially kind of in the IB and reaching the pinnacle of running the banking business. And the field of sustainability had really not crossed my radar from a business point of view. I mean, I certainly had my passions for philanthropy and for trying to do things that would be positive for the environmental community or socially or what have you. But that was sort of in a very personal capacity, not in a business way. And I was in a meeting one day and I got a phone call from my then group CEO, which I always tell the story was a bit of a shock because he was relatively new to the organization and you don't normally get a call out of the blue from your group CEO. Normally these things in a 40,000 person organization are somewhat planned. And so first thought is, what did I do? Picked up the phone, rang him back, and he said, I bet you thought that you might have done something wrong. I said, and he chuckled, and I said, funny you should say that, yes. And I don't know, it's all come see me. There's something that has been on my mind when you get the next opportunity to come to Zurich and let's have a chat. So that's really how it started. And the idea for IF was not fully formed in his mind, but it was very much, I think he could see the waves of change happening in the sense that as he was interacting with clients at the bank, they were increasingly coming around to the topic of anything from values-aligned finance and ensuring that people's investment dollars were being directed for outcomes and impact, through to even the corporate side. Many of the corporates were either facing some sort of disruption or pressure along the sustainability arena, and they were seeing very, very different behaviors in their underlying consumer base, as an example, and they were trying to with that. So he said, look, we are in a privileged position as a financial services provider and as an advisor to respond to these needs of our clients. And there's a business here, and I think you should run it. And that's how it started. And it was a completely out of the blue for me. It wasn't something that had been contemplated, obviously. And at first, I was a bit skeptical. I wasn't sure what it was. And my initial reaction, and I do always tell the story that I was a bit cheeky, and I said, with due respect, I'm a business builder. I'm a P&L person. And if this is something you want to put in the CSR report or some marketing document, not really for me. And, he challenged me to step back and do some research on the topic and get a little bit stuck in and try to understand in a comprehensive way what he was seeing, and then come back and have another discussion. So that's exactly what I did. And I did a bit of research. And the more I dug in and the more people I talked to, and the more I digested, it was an eye-opener. I said, wow, this is a very serious thing that's coming our way. And I genuinely could foresee, maybe not as quickly or with the magnitude that it is, had taken hold, but I could see it was something that was going to be very big and very serious. And the more I got into it, I often say I went from a cynic to a convert to being very evangelical about the topic of sustainability. And I'm privileged and lucky that I was early in the day. So when I inherited the mandate to do this, what I found was there was a lot of energy and a lot of pockets of excellence in the bank that were doing things in and around sustainability broadly defined, but they were doing it as a side project because they were passionate about the topic. It wasn't in a mandate. It wasn't part of their day job, so to speak. There was a fair bit to work with, but no one had ever had a global mandate to bring it all together and create a strategy and a direction and so on. So that's what I set out to do with IAF.
So was this a business actually, or was this kind of a cross-functional strategy, product development?
So it was very much designed to be a client-facing, client service effort. And it ranged from helping to create and facilitate investment products that had some sort of environmental or social outcome associated with them, as well as provide advice, because I then set about building an expert team who were facile with this topic and who had been involved in the sustainability arena for many years and were in a position to provide advice. And in addition to that, identifying where capital was needed to be raised to fund people's sustainability journeys. And that's a natural home for me because that's classic investment banking and capital market services. So whether it's taking a sustainability disruptor public or whether it's providing debt capital for them to realize their ambitions, very familiar territory, but just with a sustainability lens. So it was really all those things. And it was a global remit. So it spanned across our private bank, the institutional investing business, as well as our corporate clients. And that was the early generation. And then the success. The IAF, which at the time was called Impact Advisory and Finance, as the market developed, the word impact began to be a very specific term of art and meaning. And that's a small subset of the overall sustainability arena. So as we've evolved, we've renamed the group SSAF, Sustainability Strategy Advisory and Finance, to incorporate the broader umbrella of sustainability. But then in addition to that, in the summer of last year, so effectively a year ago, I took on the additional role of CSO, so Chief Sustainability Officer for the bank. And that is all about Credit Suisse as an enterprise. What's the ambition of the bank? What is our sustainability strategy? How do we embed it into the organization? What are the initiatives around sustainability as an organization that we're going to pursue? As an example, we've made a commitment to net zero using science-based targets. All of those sorts of things are encompassed within the CSO title. So I've got these two hats, and which is great because it's front to back. It's from the client all the way through to our organization.
Are you doing effectively both jobs?
Yep.
So you retain the former responsibilities, and then they doubled your compensation. So. I know how that works. Yeah.
No more comment.
All right, good. Well, I want to drill down a bit more on what Credit Suisse is doing, and I'm glad you developed some more acronyms because boy, we needed some more of those. But it seems like you also have a lot of external roles and affiliations, co-chair of the WEF Innovative Finance and for Humanitarian Aid and Blended Finance Task Force. I don't know if there's any that you want to discuss, but I presume you do these because it's complementary to what you're doing for the bank.
And some of it is born out of a personal interest or passion for a topic. In other cases, I find it very additive, instructive, and helpful to be part of these organizations or in some leadership capacity where, I'm a big believer, especially in the sustainability space, where collaboration in many cases is absolutely critical, if not the key to unlocking some of the difficult problems. And a lot of the organizations that I am a part of that are external to the bank really are those kinds of organizations where you might have public and private sector together or NGOs in the mix or what have you. And I find getting those different perspectives is incredibly helpful to what I do as my day job. But I can elaborate on a couple of them, but probably one that I am very proud of and very invested in many ways, the work on the Oceans Panel, because that not well understood or up to now has not been a well invested space. And yet oceans are so very critical to planetary health. We need to have collective action across policy making, the private sector, the finance sector, et cetera, if we're going to help to conserve the precious resource. So the work that we're doing there to identify investment opportunities for the private sector within categories of ocean conservation is critical. The group is trying to help set standards for, just like we have green bond principles, to have blue bond principles to facilitate institutional grade markets to invest in the space and so on. So that's just one example. There's a reflected, I'd say, positive virtuous circle by being on something like that to then think about how do we translate that into business for the bank.
Yeah. So, I've spoken with different people and we all have come to some aspect of sustainability and from different journeys. Some came about it serendipitously. Some people seem to have known that they wanted to do this since 20 years. You came to it from investment banking and from the leveraged finance background. This has to be kind of very different from that somehow, but then maybe there was some things that informed you for this. The leveraged finance world was maybe not as dynamic or not as many products and offerings back in the 90s. And it seems like you developed products then. Has that somehow informed you or prepared you for stepping into the sustainability area?
100%, because at its core, I believe one of my mandates, certainly the SSAF mandate, is to help mobilize capital at scale to help solve some of the world's biggest problems. And if you are truly going to mobilize scale in the private sector, you need to be able to speak the language of the institutional investment community. So I tend to find those who are coming up through sustainability who were maybe working for NGOs or a development bank, they would have a harder time doing this within a bank like ours because it's just not their world. And yet I came up through the traditional capital markets, capital raising, dealing every day with the institutional investor community. So I know exactly what they need, what structures work for them, what don't, what are their particular peculiarities, requirements structurally and otherwise. And so that was been very helpful because if I'm going to attempt to mobilize capital, I need to be able to do it in a format that speaks to them. Because when people have previously were complaining, and this is changing now given how much capital there is in wanting to invest in sustainability, 4 years ago there was a dearth of investment opportunities. The biggest issue we face with investors is, yes, I'd like to invest in the oceans, but there's nothing there for me, or nothing that speaks to me as a institutional investor. Yes, there might be some venture stage stuff over here, but nothing that we can put money to work in at scale that works for us, et cetera, et cetera. Having been through that for the better part of my career, it was so natural for me to say, we need to rethink how we present investment opportunities to these classes of investors. And very natural for me to think in the structured world, or even in some cases, almost like a linking of a derivative onto an investment product in a traditional sense, but with a sustainability lens and so on. So anyhow, yes, I think all that's been very, very helpful. Clearly, when I ran and was responsible for the origination side of the ECM business, that's the IPO world. So helping to take some disruptor companies who are really making change in many ways in terms of traditional industry, taking them public and providing them capital. Again, a natural for me. That's what I've done for most of my career. It's a natural segue. So despite the fact that on the surface, it doesn't seem like there's a big link between running capital markets business and this business, there was more similarities than one would think. And the other big piece of it was when I moved to Credit Suisse, and I was helping to build our corporate LevFin franchise. At that point, LevFin in Europe was nascent. You didn't have a common language. You didn't have a common set of standards. There was lots of confusion about structures. US models didn't work in Europe. So we were actually building a market. And that's kind of what we're doing in sustainability too. Some of the same principles apply. I see so many analogs. This fact that, even the word sustainability, you can look it up and you have 5 different definitions. And what are the standards that the market can have confidence in? Because when markets have confidence in principles and standards, then capital flows. And so on. So there's a lot there I think has been very, very helpful and instructive from my prior life.
Could you give one example maybe of a product that you developed or an offering you developed that you saw the opportunity that would allow it to scale for institutionals and do it, I suppose, at the ticket size that they are looking for?
A good one would be, and this carrying on with the ocean, I challenged the team to take a look, because what I was seeing is that increasingly all of our clients were using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as their language for how to characterize categories of things that they might want to invest in. Yeah. And with that becoming the language, it allowed us to use that in some ways as a framework for then thinking about how do we create financial opportunities. And so if we look at just SDG 14, which is life below water, i.e. the oceans, I had said to the team, let's map the SDGs. Let's find out where there has been a fair bit of capital flowing and it's working very well, and we need just more of it, so scale. But also let's challenge ourselves in the places where there's a dearth of capital to ask ourselves why. Is it because it's fundamentally an uninvestable SDG because it was never designed, the SDGs, to be an investment framework? Or is it just because no one's rolled up their sleeves and tried to figure it out? And that work led us to the oceans, and knowing how critical it was and being passionate about the oceans, we then commissioned an institutional poll and went to the largest asset managers and asked them a series of questions about if they were interested in investing in the ocean. If the answer was yes, were they? And if not, why not? And the answers we got back were not surprising to me in a way, but we wanted to corroborate the thesis. And most of it came back in the form that there wasn't anything at institutional scale. And so we said, well, we can do that. Let's get to work doing that. But they also wanted to have a direct link. They wanted to believe that the capital was really going to make a difference in the oceans. Otherwise, it would be too diffuse and hard to justify. That led us ultimately to create an open-ended fund focused using the power of shareholder engagement to drive corporate change so that you really can see a directed outcome of your actions related to ocean conservation. And we created a fund around that. And we did it in partnership with another institution because we felt that their focus on shareholder engagement and their track record in engagement, plus an affiliation that their organization had with an ocean NGO, a charitable foundation that had been working in the oceans for years, was a powerful combination to bring together. And so that is an example of an open-ended fund that we launched at scale. And launched last October, and it's public on our website, so I'm free to talk about it. But we're north of 600 million of capital that's been invested in that fund. And that's a pretty seminal thing because 5 years ago, if you had asked anybody, could you mobilize 600 million of capital for ocean conservation, they would have thought you were crazy.
Yeah. And that's all public equities.
And it's invested in, correct. So it's liquid, so that was key. The community preferred liquid, things that they could trade in and out of, and they wanted it to be in that asset class. And so duration-wise, that was also important. And they wanted the direct link to the outcome so that you could really understand the driving of the capital toward what you're ultimately trying to achieve. So that's just one example of many. Very exciting.
Let's get into the main thing now. Maybe you could, I don't want to spend much time on Credit Suisse itself, but you're a large balls bracket bank. Maybe you can just update me on how you present yourself and the assets under management and all that. But then I'd like to know, maybe you put in context a bit more detail about Credit Suisse's dedicated sustainable strategies and impact offerings and activities, and how much AUM you have. You're totally invested in impact and sustainable strategy.
Yeah, I guess maybe at a broad level, we redoubled our commitment to sustainability under our new chief executive a year ago. We established an umbrella organization called SRI, Sustainability Research and Investment Solutions, which EXB level function, executive board level function. And under that umbrella, we brought together my work, SSAF, as well as our buy-side and sell-side research teams and our marketing function so that we could be speaking holistically with one voice across the bank. So that group is about 1,700 professionals that are dedicated to helping to drive our sustainability ambition. And then at that time when I took on the CSO role, it's really about setting the ambition for the bank. And we've been public saying our ambition is to be a sustainability leader And again, that is a bit of a term of art, although different interpretations of what leader means. But in our world, it is very much showing leadership in the ability to mobilize capital and connect with our clients and bring them on the journey. So some of the key initiatives as part of this effort are to state not only our ambition, but then back it up with a series of commitments. So for instance, at that time when we formed the group, we said that we would commit within a decade to provide 300 billion Swiss francs of green, sustainable, and SDG aligned finance. And we committed to continue to work to migrate assets under management towards sustainability. So in some cases, it's converting what we already have by evolving those existing funds underneath a series of frameworks. So we've established our own proprietary sustainability frameworks, which we're very transparent with our clients that if something has that sustainability label, this is what that means, and also what it's not. And then finally, we committed in the fall of last year, towards the back end of the year, to net zero, as I described. But we leaned forward to say that we would commit to net zero by 2050 using science-based targets. And that's, I think quite a progressive thing to do. There are not that many organizations, certainly not in financial services, that have said they would hold themselves account to SBTI. But science-based targets is a nonprofit NGO group. So we're essentially putting ourselves in the hands of the NGOs to help us set the metrics and hold us to account about the seriousness of our ambition to get to net zero. And it's complicated. And in a large, complex organization, you have your scope 1 emissions, you have your scope 2, i.e., which is who you're buying from, your vendor and service providers. But the scope 3 is the really hard one because that's your operations. Who are you banking? Are they on a path to net zero? Making choices about business you do and don't do because it needs to be aligned with your emission reductions targets and so on. So those are just snippets of the kinds of things that we're doing, but all very serious. And then the final thing that you asked about, which is our offering, our sustainable and impact. I genuinely believe that we've shown real leadership in impact space in particular. And that's the tougher end of the stick because it's very, very deliberate with outcomes and how you're measuring them. Very pleased that we've got a best-in-class team, some of those who are early in the whole impact space, including my head of sustainable advisory, who helped co-found the Harvard Impact Management Program and has helped co-found the UN PRI, Principles of Responsible Investing. So you're deeply into this topic, PhD on the subject, and so on. So I think we approach impact in an extremely serious way. Our ambition is to, across the entire sustainability offering, be able to have a variety across our product shelf of SDG opportunities thematically, as well as up and down and across asset classes. So what we would hope, and that's the holy grail at some point, is to have that huge, and that's a big, tall order. But if a client comes in and says, I really care about oceans or healthcare education, but I really want equity strategies, we can do that. I'm prepared to have, or I want a bit of illiquid in my portfolio, but these are the themes I care about, we can do that. Then there are broad themes that are more associated with what we call our super trends, which are developed by our CIO's office and our research side of the house, where they identify the big themes of the future that are really going to change markets and economies over the next decade or so. And we have now wrapped a sustainability lens around that as well with my team to say, what are those super trends? How does that look with that sustainability lens? So one of our, as an example, because it's always easy if I talk in specifics, our super trends is millennial values. And that is this changing nature of the millennial demographic and how powerful that force is as the millennials are getting into their peak earnings years, how that's going to drive change. What they do, how they behave differently, what are the products and services that they want to buy, et cetera, how are they going to use financial services? When you wrap a sustainability lens around millennial values, it leads you to interesting thematics. And then we've created a fund, a millennial values fund that invests in those sorts of thematics. So this is sort of the translation or the journey of how we approach it. So our sustainable AUM, I'll have to come back to you and be specific with what is published. So we're not in trouble. We are beyond this, but I think the last published report of our sustainable AUM from memory was probably when we issued in April our inaugural sustainability report, which is about 118 billion Swiss franc of sustainable AUM. We may have published something publicly since then. I'll have to double check, but we're well north of that now.
You have someone maybe it's in your group or related to your group, Viola Steinhoff-Werner, who I founded the Young Investors Organization within Credit Suisse in 2007, and now I think her title's head of Next Gen or something like this. I don't know. I can't keep up with all this. So maybe first, could you just explain what this YIO and Next Gen is? And by the way, I did reach out to her, but I guess she's interested in speaking to young investors and doesn't want to speak to old guys like me. So, so maybe you can tell me what that is, and then maybe expand on this big transition in wealth transfer.
So the YIO, Young Investors Organization, is an opportunity that is supported by Credit Suisse, but they're self-governed. So it's an independent group, but we helped to found them originally and then have supported them along the way, but it really is their own organization. But it is for children of our top wealth clients. And for lack of a better word, it's almost like a club. And we have some 2,000 plus members of YIO. It is an incredibly phenomenal group. I am inspired by them because I have a lot of interaction with the group. They are entrepreneurs in their own right. In many cases, they might be inheriting family businesses, and they're grappling with the weight of that. And they're grappling in the sustainability context often about very, very serious issues that speak back to this millennial values question. Some of them don't like the businesses they're inheriting because they might be in hard carbon emitting industries and rejecting that. In other cases, they're seizing that moment to say, when I have the reins of my family company, I am going to transform it into a more environmentally friendly or socially friendly business model. So what I see is an incredible passion and determination to try to create a better world for themselves than the one that they're inheriting. And they can do it as entrepreneurs, they can do it as corporate leaders, they can do it with their money. We also see them in a big behavior change. And I think that a little bit is what Viola's alluding to as it relates to financial services and this great wealth transfer, because they do think differently. What they want from a bank is very different than what our generation wants. And what they ask of a bank is they ask questions like, what is your green footprint as a bank? Or how many IPOs have you done, for sustainable companies? And these are questions that they ask. And that is a different behavior pattern than we've seen from the past. And so if we're able to serve them properly, we need to be able to be part of that dialogue. And we also have to help them on the journey because they are looking for advice, particularly in the sustainability arena, about how to translate that passion or emotion into their business lives or their investing habits.
I think Credit Suisse has been around this subject for a long time, but I think the move to the centralized strategy is something somewhat new. Was this increased focus, in fact, driven by the private wealth business more than elsewhere within the bank?
I would say you probably would point to the fact that, again, if we go back early days in the co-founding of Responsibility, which is one of the first impact fund managers that really existed in scale, that was very much focused on microfinance. Their very first fund was all about microfinance. So this notion that you could invest for return, but also deliver positive outcomes, that's kind of the first time that people started to begin to talk about these linkages beyond just a risk-adjusted return, about it, can you do good with your money and all of this. The early investors in those funds were a combination of what I would say progressive private clients who probably were very active philanthropically, but like the idea of being able to allocate some money for return to do positive things. But we also had institutional investors, but they were smaller in nature. You weren't talking about the big mainstream, Fidelities or PIMCOs in the space. So I would say it was a combination, but I don't want to overstate the case about the drivers. I think a lot of what you've had in the intervening period is incredible enabling conditions. So you've had this maturation of the millennials who do think differently. And then you marry that with the acute reality of climate change and this sense of urgency, the media attention to it, the everything attention to it. It becomes real for you when it's your property, underwater or burning or whatever is affecting you. And it's a call to action. So I think people as individuals are driving this because now they're coming in saying, I want to make change with my money and I believe I can do it. The institutional side is coming in earnest, of course, as you see, with this whole wave of big walls of capital who want to follow ESG principles as a very big baseline. And then you have the corporates that are having to migrate their business models. So I would say it's coming at us. The enabling conditions are from everywhere. So I wouldn't necessarily say the driver is one or the other, to be honest.
Having this YIO organization must have given Credit Suisse a very early sense for the preference for sustainability investment products. And so I was wondering if maybe you could give me an idea what kind of conversations you're private bankers are having with these younger millennials, and then maybe shed some light on what are the types of products that they're demanding from, and how does this differ, of course, from 10 to 20 years ago?
So in the first instance, the kinds of conversations are very much around the notion of how do they incorporate sustainability into their lives broadly defined. So it would be as a business owner or a soon-to-be business owner, inheriting that family corporation, could be as an entrepreneur. How do I tell my sustainability story? Because I believe that I should lead with that. And many of the businesses that our YIO cohorts are starting as entrepreneurs are mission driven in their first instance. So it is, I want to solve an environmental problem. I'm creating a business around it. That's very different than entrepreneurs of the prior generation, which were, I've got a great idea and I hope to go raise money for it. They're starting with a mission and driving what they do. And the conversation with them is, how do I do it in a robust way? How do I tell my narrative in a way that will resonate with the investment community? So there's so much that's in the psyche of what they're thinking about, and they're wanting to understand then how do you translate that from everything from capital raising, or if it's I am now in a position where I can start investing, how can I make sure that my money's having impact? In some cases, which was a place I never thought I was going to find myself, is kind of guidance counselor, family broker between the older and younger generation. You do sometimes get the conversation, which again, I don't think we would have ever had 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which is my parents don't understand how serious I am about this. Can you, Credit Suisse, tell them that impact investing is a serious thing and you can generate serious financial returns? Because they're not listening to me. But if you, Credit Suisse, say it's real, then my parents might listen to you. So it's kind of these funny in the middle conversations helping to bridge these generational gaps and ideologies about what financial investing should or should not be or cannot achieve. Really quickly to finish off on the products. I talked about the concept of millennial values. That is a perfect opportunity for a YIO investor who might be an early investor. They would be more classified on the retail end of the spectrum, meaning, not a professional investor. So that needs to be in relatively safe investments that are public, liquid, tradable, the values thematic, which speaks to them. So investing in everything from vehicle electrification to plant-based food completely speaks to them. And in this particular instance, we deliberately wanted to bring the minimums down so that you don't have these high barriers to entry. So early budding investors can begin to put a little bit of money to work. So in any of your currencies, euros, dollars, or Swissies, you could put as much or as little as $10. Euros. So it begins to be a little bit of a seed way to make those linkages between values and investing. And then a lot of them, though, actually, because they grew up in this world where the tech space has been so hot, they love the idea of getting involved in innovation. They want to be putting money to work in some, maybe what I would say, venture capital stage, so more risky end of the spectrum. And they obviously have to be qualified. There's a whole series of hurdles you have to go through to make sure someone is qualified for something that is in different risk end of the spectrum. But they're very keen on it. They want to back those disruptive technologies. They're very facile with that, super into their risk tolerance, at least conceptually, how they would like their money to be used to facilitate breakthroughs. So those are other things that they find very intriguing. And again, you can't overgeneralize because, as always, this is an individual discussion with an individual person, and everybody has a different view and approach. But I'd say in the main, I find the receptivity of the younger generation to the concept of impact investing, the concept of sustainable finance as being just natural to them. And therefore, when they say, I want my money, I want to demonstrate that my money is doing something positive, how do you do that? How do you show me? Through metrics, through reporting, all of those kinds of things. And it's obviously not exclusively, not everybody asks that, not everybody cares about that, but the vast proportions do.
I have the feeling that Credit Suisse seems to believe in the power of collaboration. And the things that I've found or come to my mind, I think you've developed like a new nutrition, health, biodiversity, climate strategy with JPM. And then you already mentioned the Ocean Engagement Fund with Rockefeller Capital Management. Credit Suisse is an early collaborator with Telio, now it's Merrill Natural Capital. I think you've also been involved in the transition bonds with the Climate Bond Initiative. Why do you, if I'm right about this, why do you believe in the power of partnership approach? rather than keeping it internal, because it seems to me most people are doing it all, are trying to do it all in-house. How did you guys arrive at that, and do you believe in that? Am I right about that? Yeah.
You are absolutely 100% right about that. It's very much in the ethos ever since I began building IAF. I felt very strongly that when we're talking about some of the world's biggest challenges, there is no one person or group or organization that has a lock on good ideas. And I do believe, and I say this often, that the power of 1+1 in the sustainability arena is way more than two. And the reason is because it provides you sometimes a different level of expertise. It provides a different lens. There might be an approach that we hadn't thought of because this is a new field, relatively speaking. And so there's a lot of experimentation and innovation that's happening. And my view is if we can collaborate with partners and break what I'd say the silos of historical banking, which is very provincial, right? You're my competitor. I can, do something together with you. You come to better answers. And so whether it's the Ocean Engagement Fund with Rockefeller, what was the beautiful thing they brought to the table? 40-year track record of engagement history with demonstrable results. They brought this affiliation with the Ocean Foundation. We are not climate scientists and we are not NGOs at Credit Suisse, but they were very, very, very deeply engaged with what actually can matter to the oceans. So if you think about those two aspects of what Rockefeller brought, plus Credit Suisse's structuring and distribution power, it's just a complete win-win. We felt that in collaborating with BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset managers in the world, the combination of our two mission-driven, very aligned organizations from an ethos point of view about what we're trying to drive change. They as the largest asset manager, us as a huge private bank, powerful combination. JP Morgan, same thing for different reasons. And virtually every one of our impact investments or sustainable investments that we're creating in-house, we're doing it with a collaboration partner. Sometimes it can be a financial services organization, but oftentimes it's also an NGO because they're experts on the ground day to day in the weeds of things. And their knowledge and expertise and insight can help ensure that the dollars end up doing the good that we hope it'll do.
This large intergenerational transfer of wealth, I just expect that it's going to be snowballing. Do you think that is effectively going to transform the wealth management industry?
Almost by definition, it has to. The tipping point in where you're sitting right now in Switzerland, where more than 50% of the AUM now is sustainable. That's an extraordinary thing. Think about the history of Switzerland over hundreds of years. And in the span of, what has it been, just a couple of years, you went from 0 to 50% of all AUM. That's just one country. And you start looking at the trillions and trillions that are being poured into sustainable investing. We can't claim that that's all millennials or the next gens. That is a broader wave and paradigm shift. But agitators for that wave or huge supporters of that wave are this next generation. And when they are in control of the world's wealth, which is increasingly happening, we've seen that their behavior and their proclivities and their desires are very much in line with the sustainable investment wave. So we just feel that, as you say, will continue to increase at an increasing rate. And if you are attuned to what it is that they are asking for and responding to that in some sensible and thoughtful way, you will be aligned both in your ability to serve them, but also them wanting to do business with you.
I want to talk about, for a second, bank sustainability targets a lot of times are based on their operational footprint. You can have things like lower carbon emissions originating from their offices when arguably their real impact in the world is their financing footprint. What's a credible path to a 1.5 degree look like for a bulge bracket investment bank?
So we've committed to net zero. We're talking about the entire bank, and it is through the three scopes. So scope one, our own physical operations. So we will certainly and will continue to drive down our real estate footprint and physical assets and all of that. Scope two, who we buy from. So we are continuing to push ourselves and our vendors. And so the obvious things are we buying renewable energy as an energy source to heat our buildings and turn the lights on and so on. But we're going way beyond that to look at diversity of supply chain. So this is broadly defined. So of course there's the 1.5 degree path, but if we're talking about broader sustainability and ESG agenda, are we buying from diverse suppliers? Do they hold the same ethos? And are they on the same trajectory? But some of the areas that are not so obvious, if we are buying computing power, some of our biggest vendors are the IT companies. Are they on a path? Because if they aren't, we can't be in alignment with 1, 2, and 3. So then 3, of course, is the biggie. That's the one you just talked about. So that is who we bank and not bank, and what decisions are we making in terms of the businesses that we take on and our loan exposures and so on. So that piece is definitely a work in process. The way we're approaching it is by mapping. It's a classic 80-20 rule that for us to be on that Paris-aligned pathway and that reduction to net zero, the biggest bang for your buck will be identifying, ensuring that the highest carbon emitting industries that you're banking are on a Paris-aligned pathway alongside you. So if you can crack that, then the tail will be, as a percentage total, will be less meaningful, because obviously the highest carbon emitting industries, by definition, if they're reducing, then as a percentage of the total, that's pretty meaningful. So the way we approach that is we're systematically going through each of the highest carbon emitting industries that we have exposure to as a bank. And we're working with those clients and mapping them against what we call a grid of those who are on the journey with us, or those perhaps who don't really want to transition. If they want to transition, there must come a time when we'll probably have to part ways because it won't be in alignment with our plans. But the word transition is very operative. We can't do this overnight, and our clients can't change their entire business models overnight. So we need to be pushing them to drive toward those outcomes. And then in terms of mapping them as a standing matter, we're going through and looking at people's emissions and asking ourselves as well, are we measuring, what's the right measurement? Is it carbon intensity? Is it aggregate carbon emissions? Different things for different industries. We're getting input from third-party sources to help inform us, because in some cases, you don't even have a green pathway for some industries. So aviation is a good one, right? There is no green aviation fuel today. So we want to work to help our clients figure out ways to reduce their emissions and transition. And at some point, there will be an answer for them to be truly Paris aligned in their operations. And then we'll want to continue to promote those companies that are adopting those transition pathways. And then finally, the stub, if you will, is the areas today that you can't abate. And there, we're going to have to purchase carbon offsets or work toward, offsetting in some way, either purchasing those offsets ourselves or promoting the planting of trees or other mechanisms, carbon capture. But our belief is that is something that is only for the tail that you can't abate. You don't want to have that as an excuse to keep doing business the old way and go buy carbon offsets as a pass. Right. It has to be part of the overall transition to true net zero.
I think Credit Suisse has been one of the few who have actually been quite vocal about biodiversity. Not a lot of people are talking about that. My question is, how can investment firms realistically evaluate the biodiversity impact of their underlying investments?
Very, very early stages today in being able to identify. It's a complex field, because ecosystems, you might be doing one thing over here, not realizing the effects it has over there. And even a lot of the climate scientists don't always agree as to what are the right mechanisms to protect. But there are some very clear things that we know are critical. And so we focus on the ones that there's absolute agreement on. Deforestation is a perfect one. And that is one, there's no question as to whether that is a good thing or bad thing for biodiversity. We've got to stop deforestation and really push for sustainably managed forestry for those businesses that rely on timber. So that is very, very clear. But some of the other areas are not. But there's an enormous amount of intellectual capital being applied to these topics. There's a group called the TNFD, Task Force for Nature Finance Disclosure, made up of NGOs and climate scientists and banks and governments, saying, could we credibly identify the handful of financially material factors by industry that companies could concentrate on, just like carbon emissions. So a number or two numbers, not 50 things, but a handful of many really meaningful things that companies could drive in addition to carbon emissions in their business to help protect the biodiversity equation. It's always hard to point those out because a lot of this is in debate and discussion now and being analyzed. But something like perhaps if you're in the agriculture industry, nitrogen runoff is a huge issue with the pesticides that are used in agriculture. So if we could just call that in agriculture, that's meaningful. So perhaps as financial institutions, just like we're saying, we expect you, or as investors, we expect you to reduce your carbon emissions. Once there's broad agreement on what those things are, the financial services community, policymakers, the whole ecosystem of stakeholders could drive companies to say, we want you to focus on this too. And that really matters. And that's the end state of where we ultimately want to get to. But we feel it's critically important, and we're dead serious about trying to help to crack that code.
So you're the chief sustainability officer. Do you face internal struggles with the profitability of what I would call traditional non-sustainable products internally? I mean, do you have a hard time getting open discussions about this, about hydrocarbons, for example? I think Credit Suisse is a large financer of coal mining. You're not the only one. I think BlackRock's got like 80 billion or something like that.
So, of course, anytime you're in transition, there are tension points without question. But at the same time, I think the broad understanding is that the mandate that we've committed to, which is to net zero across scope 1, 2, and 3, that's including the business operations, we've crossed that threshold. That decision's been made. And therefore, the organization now has to figure out the most sensible way to do that. And we have to be sensible. We're a profit-making organization. It does not involve going and firing all our clients in any high carbon emitting industry and jettisoning them. That's not logical. And frankly, if we did that, we wouldn't have an ability to engage with them anyway. There's actually power in our ability to provide capital to them, both to help the transition, but also to use that as leverage to have them engage. So these are the tools that are at our disposal, and we think that we've got a big role to play in that participation. But there's no doubt that you need to work through these things, because those who've covered traditional industries, they also have to transition. As always, when you're asking anybody to change their behavior or what they've done for 20 or 30 years, it requires a re-education process. I have to say, the necessity of climate change is such a call to action that it's not, maybe years past, it'd be like, who are these people over here, getting in the way of my business, like trying to tell me I'm supposed to do something green over here, that was the perception, right? Who are these people? They're not serious business people or any of this. Those debates are gone. People know the world has got to change, and I think that provides a lot of groundswell to get the organization behind what we're trying to accomplish.
But if you had to name the one most important challenge in the sustainable and responsible investment space that we have at this time, what would it be?
It would be access to reliable, high quality, defensible, and comparable data, because that is a big hurdle for our industry to get to accomplish things we want to accomplish. And the consistency of data, the accuracy of it isn't really there yet in so many spaces. And that holds the industry back, both from confidence from the financial markets, but also the ability to know that you're actually on the right track. And so that to me is a real biggie.
Were you ever involved in an investment decision that you were convinced ticked all the boxes, but in the end it didn't turn out, went pear-shaped? And what was the lesson learned from that?
Does it need to be a sustainability investment or it could be any investment?
Give me whatever. It can be anything.
So I'm an angel investor. So most by definition, you're going to get it wrong many, many times because you're investing in stage unproven businesses and technologies. Where I think I've got it wrong most of the time is when I didn't fully appreciate the cost side. So a good example of one that didn't make it was, and this is again not anywhere near the sustainability field, but it was in the clothing rental business. So you have something called Rent the Runway, which is, you can rent fashion gowns instead of having to pay for it. And it's been very successful, a unicorn company. So members of that company went into the bridesmaids dresses rental business. If you ask any young woman when they're at that stage of their life, when they get the phone call from their best friend that says we'd be a bridesmaid and you have to buy the dress, you think, oh gosh, here we go, another dress I'll never use, stick it in the closet. And when you're at that certain age when all your friends are getting married, you might get 5 of those calls. So this idea of using the Rent the Runway theme for bridesmaids dresses, if you ask any young woman, oh, what a brilliant idea. That's exactly what I said, what a brilliant idea. What I didn't focus on was the inventory requirement for that business versus Rent the Runway. Rent the Runway is one size, it doesn't matter. In this instance, you had to have 5 or 6 of every dress in every color and every size in order to meet the bridal party need. And then the ability to reuse, typically people get a little fast and loose with everything. Ripped it and whatever. And you looked at the inventory cost of maintaining what you needed to do to serve the client was a complete bust model versus the business it was born out of. And even though it was wildly successful on the surface, the company went into administration. They never made it because the cost infrastructure, the more successful they were, the more money they lost. And
but they're going to make it up in volume.
But it doesn't always work that way. There are some businesses that never hit a leverage tipping point. So that was, one that didn't make it, and it didn't make it fast, even though it was a big flash in the pan and wildly successful. I went with a visceral reaction as a potential consumer of the product, and I didn't think about the inventory implications of what success meant. I was blind to that. And I think the big takeaway is high revenue growth models can often blow up. Like success, if you can't manage the growth, take you down. There are many companies that busted because they had too much demand for their product and they didn't have the operational expertise or ability to respond to that growth.
Was there a time that you passed on a deal, or maybe you invested, but you were skeptical, and then in the end it just really turned out, and you were pleased you invested, or you regretted not investing, and what was the lesson learned from that?
I mean, there's so many regrets. The biggest regrets I would have across a very long period of time was not in investing in companies where I was the user of the product, actual user of the product, and thought, wow, this is really solving a problem or a need, or it's making my life easier. And I just didn't translate my usage pattern to how big those businesses could become. So early days, I wish I had invested in Apple when the iPad came out, because it didn't occur to me that everyone in the world was going to use an iPad. And early days, Starbucks. I had that first cup of Starbucks coffee, and I saw it proliferating. And I thought, even though I was going to Starbucks every day, getting my coffee every morning, and then all of a sudden seeing it in our canteen and everywhere else, I should have invested way back then when I was using it, saying this is something that I can see myself as a repeat user using or whatever. So I think those are. I'm generalizing now, but it's those areas where I didn't translate my own usage patterns into why wouldn't I invest in the company if I think it's so fabulous. I think that's probably a very good example.
And then quickly, probably someone a lot younger than you or I wants to get into the sustainable investment space. How would you advise them, or where would you advise them to get into the business or to cut their teeth?
It depends on whether you mean sustainability broadly defined or sustainable investment specifically. If it's sustainable investment specifically, I think you first need to get a good grounding in finance. So because it is so much easier to take good financial foundation and apply a sustainability overlay to it than it is the other way around. If you start with sustainability, it's hard to learn the finance piece. So back to our earlier conversation about, I felt it was an easy transition for me because I spoke the language of the investors from a long history of being in the markets. And the sustainability piece was new, but my fundamental financial underpinning and ability to structure transactions was there. So I would say, don't necessarily sweat the sustainability piece. If you really want to be in the investments world, get a good solid grounding in either investment product creation or investment sales or any other area broadly in and around that investment place, being a relationship manager, et cetera. The sustainability piece, because this is such a high organic growth market, and it will be so for decades to come, almost by definition, you'll get that as an overlay. Because you can't be a good relationship manager if you can't talk about sustainability, to our comment. You can't be a good product creator these days, creating investment products, if you don't understand the ESG overlay. So that's almost a necessity that'll come as part of getting that good grounded foundation. And I will always say, but of course I will admit my bias, that banking training is something that is very hard to articulate to people at the early stage of their career, how serious that can be to create a foundation for anything else you want to do in later in life. No matter what you want to do, if you get that great banking training, that credit training, or that M&A and modeling training, all of that just serves you so well for future career opportunities, because it's hard to go back and learn that when you're 30 years down the line. You want to get in there early and learn first.
Yeah. Listen, this has been incredibly informative for me. I really appreciate you being so gracious with your time. So thank you very much. I've learned a lot listening to you speak. But I appreciate you taking the time coming off of your holiday so quick. So thanks very much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please do me a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to receive future episodes. You can find more interviews, articles, and information on sustainable and responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you enjoyed this interview and you would like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get yourself a copy of my book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 Degrees. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 Degrees is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.